What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery, and welcome. I guess you could call this season 2. It's 2023. We started last July, so I'm just going to count 2022 as season 1, and here we are with episode 1, season 2. I can't believe they allowed us to come back. I don't know who they are, but thank you for listening, because obviously without you, I'd be just sitting here talking to myself, which technically right now I am. But I do have some ideas for 2023. To be honest, life is just busy right now, so trying to work out some of those details. But rest assured, as long as you're following me on my social media, as well as liking and subscribing everywhere, whether it's the podcast or the video, you'll be sure to be in the loop once I get there. I'm thinking at this point, a lot's going to be dependent upon what happens this Sunday with the Eagles. If they get the number 1 seed, then I feel as though they have a more legitimate shot to go far into the playoffs. They could fall all the way to 5th at this point, which is unfathomable if you think about it. But the fact of the matter is, if Washington or the Cowboys beat Washington and the Eagles lose, all of a sudden they don't win the division and they drop down into that 5th spot, and the road just got tougher. So I'm feeling things out on when I'm going to start some things. I do want to bring on more guests. I want to do some live shows. So I just trying to work out some of the details. I think I do need to upgrade some of my equipment as well. So, and not to bore you guys with some of this stuff. So just things I need to do on my end that I just obviously just haven't had time between kids basketball and dance and holidays and everything. But as always, let's start off with the state of Philly sports. Philly's still making some minor trades and signings. Some of the relievers they brought in are kind of under the radar. However, if you read some of those articles and read about some of these guys they're bringing in, they have a ton of potential, which I feel for bullpen guys, that's where you want to take it and kind of what you want to do. Obviously, you want the stars. So since the last time we spoke, I believe they signed Craig Kimbrell. I'm not sure if that happened before we did the last podcast or not, but that's a huge signing for them. It's a 1-year, $10 million prove-it deal for him, and those are the kind of deals I like. That's like right out of Howie Roseman's playbook, where, all right, you're a veteran, you've had a decent career, a pretty good career, I think you could say Kimbrell has had. So the fact that he's coming in $10 million to a team that needs the help in the bullpen but has an established core, I think the sky's the limit for him. So now that you have some of those big pieces in the bullpen, taking some risks and some chances on some of these guys, I think is the way to go. That's what happened for them in 2008. Brad Lidge was the guy they brought in, and they signed him more long term, but they brought in J.C. Romero was one. Can't think of some of those guys off the top of my head, but they had some pieces that they just brought in for the bullpen that really worked out for them. So I'm liking what I'm seeing from this team, but obviously it's on paper right now, and we all know that you don't want to be a paper champion. Remember Vince Young with the Dream Team, and I'm not even saying the Phillies are a Dream Team. I'm just saying you actually have to go out on the field and play. So once football season ends, we'll focus a little bit on basketball and hockey, but our eyes are going to be towards spring training in February and March, and just see where these Phillies are. Because as I've said a few times now on both this and This Day in Philly sports history, I've always felt this coming season for the Phillies was the breakout year. So the other teams got better. However, I feel still this is the Phillies' year, and you still have Bryce Harper, who's going to be coming back almost like a trade deadline pickup. Flyers are currently 26. We've talked a lot on this podcast about wanting them to tank to get one of those top 3 picks. They're within striking distance, but they've been beating the teams below them in the standings. They're currently on a 3-game winning streak. They are back home in Philly tonight to take on the Phoenix Coyotes. So let's hope that we can not go on too much of a win streak and get ourselves back into the playoff race, because as constructed, this team is not good enough to compete. I'll throw in a bonus because the Owls are currently 3-0 in the American Athletic Conference. I believe they have the best record of all of the Philly teams right now, including Villanova. But this is their best start in AAC history for them. And it just is super frustrating because they kind of are playing decent. I think they found their identity. But those stupid games to like Wagner and Penn are really hurting them right now. So they're going to have to actually win the AAC tournament, which is definitely not an easy task, especially with Houston, who is a legitimate Final Four contender. But this is what happens. Hopefully it's something they can build on, and it's not, they don't get crushed by the transfer portal and all that. Big win for the Sixers last night. I'm actually going to be heading down tomorrow with the family. So excited about that. But they're still holding down the 5th spot in the East. But they're only 2.5 out of first. So basically you have the first 5 teams, and then there's a significant like 3 or 4 game drop off before you get to number 6. So they're well within striking distance. And I said it this morning on This Day in Philly Sports History, but I'll say it again here. I got to give Doc Rivers some credit because of the way he's been coaching with the injuries and his rotations and getting those bench guys involved. I had him on the hot seat. We dropped it down to the lukewarm seat. And at this point, I would say it's definitely a room temperature seat. I do want to see what he does into the playoffs, because this is typically, at least with the Sixers, this is when he does well, gets them going on a run, get one of the top 3 seeds in top 4 seeds in the East, and then come playoff time, first round he's good, but then that second round of the playoff, it's kind of like how Fran Dunphy was in the first round, Doc Rivers is in the second round. So, but I will cut him some slack and back off of him a little bit, because I am happy with the way he's been coaching and whatnot. So we'll see what goes on. But I'm still watching you, Doc, but your seat is not so hot, so you can cool down for a little bit. And finally, the Eagles, as I mentioned earlier, it comes down to this weekend. Basically, they just need to win. And yeah, there are some other scenarios. This team loses. You don't want to do that. You just want to win. I haven't heard an update from practice today. Yesterday, Jalen did practice, but it was a walkthrough practice, and he was a full participant, apparently, but he was listed as a limited participant. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's gamesmanship by Sirianni. Not sure what's going on. I want to see what happened today to get a good sense. Obviously, Friday is usually the day that determines a lot. But I want to see how today went and whether he was fully in. But the fact that he's throwing, I think, is a good sign. He's trending toward playing, especially since he would have played had that Dallas game meant something more. All signs point to that he would have played. I think they assumed and figured they would have won, especially the way Gardner Minshew played against Dallas. I think they just assumed that was going to continue. I have a feeling if Gardner played against Dallas the way he played last week, we would have seen Jalen Hurts last week. But purely speculation, no facts or anything on that. So we'll see how it goes. But I kind of have a feeling we're going to see Jalen come in. They're going to play. I think the spread right now is 14, because the assumption is the Giants aren't going to play anybody anyway. So we're in a good spot. We were not in a great a spot as we were 3 weeks ago. However, we're still in a good spot. This is what you get, kind of your rewards, as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. So the fact that you were 13-1, you put yourself in a position where you had to win one of your last 3 games. Now it's set up where the Giants don't have anything to play for. So we're looking good, but again, you got to, just like the Phillies not wanting to be paper champions, we want to make sure we actually get it done on the field. All right. So we're going to stick with the Eagles once again, and I will say It does seem like we're doing a lot of Eagles, but if you think back over to the history of this podcast so far, in when we first started, we did a lot of Philly stuff. And I did the previews of the seasons, and then we're in football season. Once football season is over, we'll get more into some of the basketball, or NFL draft, some NHL, and just some college basketball things, just things like that to mix it up more. It's just that the timing of everything, a good chunk of the episodes for this podcast occurred from the beginning of training camp until now. So if you're not a huge Eagles fan, which I don't know anybody who is a Philadelphia fan, even Flyers fans are Eagles fans to a certain point. So, but just wanted to make sure I threw that out there because I have the next 3 months laid out, and there are definitely more basketball and baseball and hockey things coming up. So stay tuned for that. But since we're staying with football, this is this week, or next week, I should say, depending on when you're listening. It's the 32nd anniversary of when Buddy Ryan got fired. So he was fired on January 8th, 1991. And basically, him and the owner, Nroman Braman, I guess the nicest way to put it is they were just never too fond of each other. And part of it is just mindset. Braman wanted the team to be more disciplined, which in doing some of the research, apparently Buddy Ryan teams were extremely disciplined. They just kind of played with some swagger, which at the time was kind of frowned upon in the NFL. A lot of the things they did, not necessarily the hits. The hits would definitely be illegal today, but some of the celebrations and some of the penalties they took, guys do that after like a regular tackle, after a running back gets a 15-yard gain, and they get up and hoop and holler and everything. But Braman felt the team was taking too many penalties, is what he said. And they did have the reputation for being dirty. I mean, Andre Waters' nickname was Dirty Waters. But there was a Bounty Bowl where we talked about the pain of the players for hits on certain guys on the team, and claimed he was sick of not winning. And I'm going to put that in quotes. He was sick of the team not winning. And obviously that was not winning in the playoffs because they were one of the best teams win-wise over the course of Buddy Ryan's time there. And simply said he was just embarrassed. He felt like he was a laughingstock. And I think a lot of that comes from him not necessarily wanting, maybe not so much wanting, because I don't know. He looked at the Eagles more of an investment than trying to win. Where as much as he can be an annoyance sometimes, and it felt early on in his ownership he tried too hard, I think legitimately Jeffrey Lurie wanted to win. Yes, it's an investment for him. The Eagles are worth almost $1 billion, I think, if they're not worth $1 billion. But he does want to win. Where Braman, I think he bought them as an investment, was looking for ways to make money, and a lot of that we'll see as we go through this came out when it came time for free agent contracts and re-signing players and things like that. He just was more interested in money than winning sometimes. So you have that where Buddy was a winner. Buddy came to the Eagles after being the defensive coordinator for the 85 Bears. He was a winner. He came in with sort of that swagger because, I mean, the 85 Bears to this day is considered the greatest defense probably ever. I would put the Eagles' 91 defense up there, but they didn't win anything. So that's why. So you got Buddy Ryan coming in, and because of that pedigree, because of that swagger he had, he did and said whatever he wanted to when he came into Philly. He was like, this is my show. I'm going to do what I want. We talked about Bounty Bowl again. I mean, it was more accepted back then. But, I mean, not many. You didn't hear about too many other teams like CBS pumping it up. He would argue with Jimmy Johnson in the media. You had the whole fake spike thing against the legendary Tom Landry. And if you're not watching this, I'm rolling my eyes and making hand gestures because it's Tom Landry. But I mean, Landry ran up to score on him, but he was like, "Fuck you, I'm getting you back." So he did the spike. He benched Randall in the wild card game in 1990 against Washington. If you listen to This Day in Philly Sports History, we talked a little bit about that this morning. It was only from one play, but it pissed off Randall. It pissed off Braman, and may or may not have may have been one of the final straws that sort of broke the camel's back, because it did take him a few days to figure out what he wanted to do. He before the Fog Bowl, he had the Eagles team's buses go around Soldier Field, beeping the horn, basically saying "Buddy's here." It's just the kind of guy he was. So, you, as a player, as a fan, you like that. That's what you want your team. You want that excitement. You want that swagger. You want that edge. You want that confidence. Then that's what you want. Where you're the owner and you're more interested in making money, that's kind of, I can see where the divide started. And then it also didn't help that Buddy openly made fun of Braman and just did things to purposely irritate him. He would always call him the guy in France because that's where his vacation. And where Lurie does live in the Philly area, I believe. I could be making that up, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of the owners live near where their teams are. Braman openly said he traveled 16 times a year, and it's one of the reasons why he wanted to sell the team eventually. It got to be too much. So, like I said, he treated it as a business. I read this when I was doing the research for this. I think this is great. In '87, they had the players' strike where they brought in replacement players, and they famously called them scabs, which is, I'm not too up on the union linger and strike breakers and things like that, but I guess a scab is somebody who crosses the picket line or whatever. So these were the replacement players. They called them scabs. So he presented a team executive with a scab rings, which at a press conference, which basically said, "Thanks for putting together the worst collection of replacement players." So if you follow anything about Buddy Ryan, he absolutely hated those replacement players, and they were terrible. They 100% were terrible, which I think played into his resentment to Tom Landry for running up the score. He's like, these guys are a bunch of scrubs, and here you are with half of your best players on your team running up the score on me. No, fuck you. So just things like that. And I think that whole dynamic, it almost seems like it was doomed from the start. I think Nroman Braman hired Buddy Ryan because it almost felt like he had to. And then it's almost like he instantly regretted it. So that's sort of what happened. That's the background. But Buddy, for all of the things that he did that maybe they didn't like, I mean, he wasn't a horrible coach. In '86, they went 5-10-1, but he was still sorting through the slop that he inherited. Marion Campbell was just a horrible coach. He was the guy beforehand. And he had aging veterans that were left over from the Super Bowl Vermeil era. They had missed on a shitload of draft picks, so he had a bunch of guys that just were not any good. But in '86, he was able to sort through that and start beginning to grow his team. He recognized right away that Randall needed to be the quarterback over Jaworski, so that was like his first order of business. And I think they did split that first year. But Buddy Ryan's best thing, I would say, other than being a defensive genius, was his eye for talent. And on both sides of the ball, he was very, very good. And probably this is what hurt the team more than his coaching after he left, was his just eye for talent. So in the '86 draft, he drafted Keith Byers, Anthony Toney, Matt Darwin, Seth Joyner, Clyde Simmons. Those were guys that contributed to Buddy's teams and even after Buddy left. And he already had Reggie, Mike Quick, Andre Waters, Wes Hopkins. So the groundwork back in '86, the groundwork for Buddy's team was laid. It was just a matter of him now getting his guys in. And you see this all the time with coaches. It takes them, they kind of spend that first year when they inherit a team, figuring out what they have, what pieces they want to keep, getting rid of the ones they don't, and then they start bringing in their guys. '87 was the strike season. We touched on that last week with the Fog Bowl somewhat. The Eagles went 7-8. And so that was Buddy Ryan's second season, and that was an improvement. But because of it being the strike season, they lost 25% of that year. So that is a huge chunk for a young team, a coach that basically '87 would have been his first year with, quote unquote, his guys or his team. And the team that we knew as Buddy's team, this was the first year we kind of were introduced to them, and losing a quarter of that season, I mean, from a gelling standpoint and from just experience and all of that, that's a huge, huge loss, especially when you had a game, or two games, I guess. Then the strike happened, you missed 4, and then you weren't able to practice, so then you had to get back into it. That's a big, big deal, especially back then when they didn't have the off-season workouts and the OTAs and mini camps and things like that. It was basically up to these guys. Preseason was a lot longer because guys had to get in shape. So they had just gotten in shape, and then basically them were off for 4 or 5 weeks, and then you had to build back up. But again, going back to his eye on talent, he drafted Nroman Braman, Byron Evans, David Alexander, the center. He also was able to pick up Chris Carter in the supplemental draft, which he did famously cut for for catching touchdowns, and that's all he does. But the story eventually came out. Chris Carter said that he would have killed himself because of drugs and alcohol if Buddy didn't cut him. So basically saved his life. And Buddy, and this is the kind of guy Buddy Ryan was, fell on the sword, cut Chris Carter, didn't put his business out there. I don't think anybody said anything about Chris Carter's drug and alcohol until Chris Carter actually came out and said it. Buddy didn't say a word, and he took the heat for it because Chris Carter ultimately is a Hall of Famer, but was a good receiver back then. And it was one of the things over the course sometimes of Randall's whole career, he lacked that second receiver next to Mike Quick until it was almost too late. So that was one of the things, and Buddy put his players first. And I'm going to get more into that in a few minutes, but that to me sums up what Buddy Ryan was, that he loved the kid, drafted him in the supplemental draft, but then was willing to cut him to save his life, even if it meant hurting himself. So in '88, we talked all last week about that. That was the Fog Bowl year. They finally won the division. I think it was the breakout season for all of them. But again, you added more pieces. You added Keith Jackson, Eric Allen, and Izell Jenkins. Even though his nickname was Toast, he was a starter on that team. And the sky was the limit. I mean, after '88, I think the expectations for Buddy Ryan and that team were sky high. And I still will go to my grave. We talked about it last week, and they would have probably gone out to San Francisco that year and beaten the 49ers if it wasn't for the fucking fog. But I don't want to dwell on that because that was last week's episode. If you want more on the Fog Bowl, check out last week's Back to the Future. So then 1989 they came in. They went 11-5. They didn't win the division. They were a game behind the Giants, who they beat twice. So think about that. They, once again, improved their win total, took second place. The first place team they beat twice. So you're still seeing the improvement. They drafted Jesse Small, Heath Sherman, Britt Hager, who had one sweet mullet back in the day. But this is when things sort of, I don't want to say started to fall apart, but this is where it's the not being able to win the big game or a playoff game started to happen to Buddy, because they lost to the Rams 21-7 in a game that they just played sloppy, and they confused Randall. And part of it was just the lack of offensive guidance he had. That was the year that Doug Scoville, the quarterback's coach, passed away in the middle of the season. He was a huge father figure to Randall, and really was the guy that Randall and everybody kind of credits with Randall becoming Randall. I don't know necessarily how much of an offensive mind Doug Scoville was, but from a quarterback perspective, he's the one that made Randall who he was. So when he died, he wasn't able to make some of those adjustments, and I don't know. I mean, Ted Plum was older, and I don't know much about his background or his history, but Randall just was never the same that year after Doug Scoville died. And in that Rams game, they famously said afterwards of how they knew exactly what to do to confuse him. And I think Buddy's so focused on that defense, and he entrusted the offense to guys who maybe had more of an old school mindset that weren't necessarily able to take what Randall had and harness it in. And say what you want about him, and we talked about it on one of the episodes when we talked about the 91 season when Randall blew out his ACL. Say what you want about the guy. He sort of harnessed Randall and made him better. It just was Randall was allowed to do whatever he wanted for so long that's why there was some butting of the heads with Kotite and him. So speaking of Kotite, 1990 was his first year, and the Eagles they took a step back, I guess you could say, to 10-6, but they were the second place team in the NFC East. The Giants, who were basically this is the year they won the Super Bowl. So I mean, they went 13-3. So not a bad season at all to go 10-6 and finish in second place to the Giants, who would win the Super Bowl. But Kotite was hired as the offensive coordinator and was, like I said, was able to kind of harness what Randall had and start building the offense around him. And they went out and they got Buddy, to his credit, got him some guys. And this was when Chris Carter got cut, but he brought in Fred Barnett. He brought in Calvin Williams. And those are the guys. They had monster years that year. Ben Smith was a starter. They went to Washington, they played Washington in the wild card game. Things were starting to get better. And yeah, they lost that wild card game, but things were starting to gel under Kotite. I mean, Randall had pretty much like a monster year in 1990. He was second in the MVP. They finally, basically what Kotite did was introduce a running game. So that year they had like 2,500 rushing yards. Randall himself had 900, which opened up the pass. He had 35 passing touchdowns, 3,500 passing yards. And that was just in his first year. So you kind of felt like, yeah, you're kind of pissed off that they lost. However, that Washington team, by the way, and I think a lot of people overlook this sometimes, they ended up the following year, won the Super Bowl after going 14-2, and many people will say they're ranked as the top team, Super Bowl winning team ever. And if they're not the top, many places will have them ranked second or third. So the Super Bowl has been played for 50-some years at this point. You lost in a wild card to a team that was on the cusp of becoming one of the greatest teams to win the Super Bowl. So you kind of, as disappointing as it was at the time, you had this sense like, okay, they're starting to gel. The defense was on the cusp of greatness. And the offense now is starting to get it together. They finally had a running game. For years, that was the thing. They never had a running back. But under Kotite, they were able to figure it out. And then dumbass Braman fired Buddy Ryan because he was sick of not winning. Even though he went 43-35 in 5 seasons. So it's roughly almost 9 wins a season. And you take that first season out of there, and all of a sudden, that number looks a hell of a lot better. But the big number, and I guess the only one that mattered to Nroman Braman, was 0-3, and that was Buddy's record in the playoffs. I do feel, for me, I remember I was in middle school, and I remember hearing and like just being shocked that they fired him because, one, he was so beloved. Two, they were so bad for so like the drop off after the Super Bowl year with Dick Vermeil was so large that, man, we just made the playoffs 3 straight years, and one was because of the fog. Two, our quarterback's mentor died in the middle of the season. And the third, we lost to what was going to be one of the greatest teams ever as our offense was gelling finally and figuring it out under their first year of really having an offensive coordinator that knew what he was doing. So that makes sense. Let's fire him. Well, as shocked as I was, the players were not too happy. Keith Jackson was probably one of the only offensive guys to speak out. But here's some of his quotes. He basically said, if Buddy's not going to be around, I don't want to be around either. In an interview, he said, the owner's stupid. Get that on record. He doesn't have much brains, that's for sure. I want to be on Plan B, which was free agency. You can write that in your book. I came here today so I can leave. You can write that in your book. And I will not be at training camp. You can write that in your book too, which he did hold out, and he ended up leaving via free agency after the 91 season. And he was like one of the first guys to be granted free agency, and one of the, obviously Reggie was like the poster child for it, but Keith Jackson was one of the guys who signed one of the first big free agent contracts. Jerome Brown pretty much echoed that. I think it's kind of stupid. But he went on to talk about how close they were. And he said, I was very close to him. We all were. And we did things for Buddy we wouldn't do for other coaches. So Buddy had that team and that defense believing they could do. And obviously it was both sides of the ball. It wasn't just the defense. The offensive guys thought the same thing. It's going to be rough. A lot of players will say it, and a lot of players might be scared to say it. So people were scared to speak out. Obviously Keith Jackson wasn't. He was like, fuck it. Get me the fuck out of here. And speaking of that, Mike Pitts kind of said the same thing. I think the feeling around here, the entire team, is that it was a mistake. And he said it, he was very blunt about it too. It's the Eagles' loss and some other teams' gain, referring to the possibility and likelihood, which he ultimately did, that Buddy Ryan got another coaching job somewhere else. And several of the players said they would go wherever he could. And ultimately, Joyner, Simmons, Waters, Terry Hogue, and others actually went down to Arizona to play with him. And he took guys, Jim McMahon went down to Arizona. He took guys that played with him in Chicago. That's how much beloved he was. And there would have been more, but the way the league sort of had changed with free agency made it harder. Mike Pitts said, we let Buddy down, and that's a true fact. And I think that was a general consensus that Buddy took the blame for this, but it was on the players. And I don't even know if they're losing to teams. Like the NFC East was a juggernaut back then. Like they were, if it wasn't the 49ers, it was the Giants, Washington, or Cowboys winning the Super Bowl for like a 10 to 15 year span. Maybe even 20 if you go back into the mid 80s. So it's insane. Reggie even said, this is where the seeds were planted for Reggie to leave. I don't think I want to play here anymore. And Buddy, who I will say it's kind of ridiculous that he was interviewed in the facility by the Philly media after he had cleaned out his office after getting fired. Just bizarre. But he said, it's like, he put it into perspective, but he still got his shot in at Braman, which rightfully so. He's like, I've been fired before, but usually it's for losing. He didn't think we could go to the next level, whatever that is. And I mean, Buddy should have known what that was. That's the Super Bowl. However, I don't think Braman looked at it in the broader picture. He just looked at it in a vacuum with blinders on. Okay, we just lost 3 straight years, not thinking about the impact or the implications that it might have. But that's what you're going to get when you have a guy who's more worried about making money than winning. I think Seth Joyner summed it up and said it best. It's ridiculous. Usually a head coach is fired because he's not winning, which is a great point. Marvin Lewis spent how many ever years in Cincinnati, and he went 0-7 in the playoffs. Yet they were competitive every year, and they never won a playoff game, whether it was a divisional round or a wild card round. And I mean, they've had some bad breaks too. But I mean, he's right. And I think Joyner was, and looking at him today, he's very emotional, and he was trying to not let his emotions get the best of him there. But there's a lot of emotions going on inside that want to come out. But I can't let myself say everything I want to say because I have to be concerned about myself. So he was afraid that he was going to lose his job. But he did go on to say, which I think was obvious, maybe not so much at the time. I feel like now with social media and the 24-hour news cycle, this would have been a much bigger story. But he said there's something personal between him and Braman. I think he had his mind made up a long time ago, Joyner said, and he, meaning Braman, just had to wait to make sure we stumbled and fell before he made his decision, which I don't know if I necessarily disagree with that. If you think about it, I guarantee you if he won that game against Washington, he would not have gotten fired. It was just an easy, okay, here we go. Boom. It's easy to get rid of him now. And which is frustrating. And I don't think he ever had a chance. I think from day one, Braman regretted hiring Buddy Ryan once he realized what he was getting into. And he just never had a chance. And I think that's why Buddy is so beloved in Philly, even though he's never won anything. And sort of like, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about the whole underdog mentality that Philly has. Right or wrong, that's basically what Philly does. And I think Buddy Ryan, we looked at him sort of as the underdog. You had the guy that's going out there and saying the things that we're thinking and getting the team fired up and saying, fuck the Cowboys, I hate Dallas, and this, that, and the other thing. And then you have up here on the pedestal, you have the owner, that guy in France. So I think Buddy played perfectly. And to be honest, like in preparing for this and going through a lot of this, and I think I've said this too a couple times on this, I don't necessarily script out what I'm going to write. I do a lot of notes and just kind of bullet points and talking points and then just kind of go with it. But like as I'm talking about this, like everybody always says, why is Buddy Bryant so loved in Philly? He never won anything. And why do we love the Kelly Green jerseys? They never won anything in them. Buddy Ryan was not Andy Reid. And that is not to take anything away from Andy Reid. That team probably, yes, from a success standpoint, should be way more beloved than these Eagles. But I think it's kind of just hitting me right now. It was the underdog thing. And Philly wanted a winner. You had the Sixers who won in 83. And now at this point, we're like, 8, 9, 10 years since the team had won a championship. So even longer for the Eagles. I mean, it was 60, so you're still 20-some years. And I think Buddy just bought into that, and Buddy just said what we were thinking and sort of represented us. And that's why Buddy Ryan's so beloved. So if anybody ever asks you, why does Philly love Buddy Ryan even though he never won anything, now you have your reason why. Fucking Nroman Braman. But, so today, the what if, I think the only way to go is, you don't know what would have happened in 91 either way. But I think to say that Buddy should not have been fired after the 1990 season is spot on and pretty appropriate. So the what if is, what if they let Buddy coach one more year? So from an offensive standpoint, that offense was going to continue to grow, and it did continue to grow in 91 under Kotite. Well, it would have had Randall not gotten hurt, but Randall was the runner-up for the MVP in 1990. I still say his injury in 91 was very fluky. I still think the offense would have continued to grow. Maybe he doesn't get hurt because with Buddy as his coach, maybe he plays a little bit freer or looser, knowing that Buddy had his back. And maybe, I don't know, and that could go the other way. Maybe he never gets over getting benched. But I think the way Buddy would have met with him, Buddy would have worked it out, and everything, I think, would have been fine. And I have a feeling maybe he wouldn't have been so tight or felt the need to stay in the pocket. Yes, the offense was a little bit different under Kotite as head coach, but maybe, just maybe, with Buddy there, he kind of goes back to that, go out and make 5 plays and we'll win the game, but do it in a more controlled environment with Kotite as your coach. You never know. They had the offensive firepower. I mean, Calvin Williams and Fred Barnett were phenomenal. They finally were starting to run the ball. And by having the threat of a running game, that's going to make Randall that much more dangerous. Keith Jackson's going to come in happy. There's his coach. He still would have been pissed off at Nroman Braman and wanted a new contract. But I still feel as though that you got a happy Keith Jackson with Randall and all of that. They could have been a dominant team. I mean, Jackson made 3 Pro Bowls after he left. Reggie White, you saw what he did after he ultimately left. Seth Joyner, Clyde Simmons, they were all solid people. Randall was Randall. Randall just needed to get out of his own head. And the defense probably would have, because of the way the landscape was changing in the NFL, may have been hard to keep that core together because they were all Pro Bowl players and would have wanted to get paid. But who knows? I don't think there's any way if Buddy Ryan stayed, no chance Reggie leaves. Reggie would have stayed as long as Buddy was there. Likely, you're probably going to get players that are willing to take the hometown discount to play with Buddy. Think about that. A lot of those guys couldn't wait to get the hell out of here. But these are the guys that were the most vocal about Buddy Ryan getting fired were the ones that left. So imagine you don't think Seth Joyner might have said, you know what? I could get more money here, but I'll stay because I like playing with Buddy. It probably doesn't do anything to change Nroman Braman dying, which still would have been a huge loss for that team. I feel like he was right on the cusp of becoming a generational player, like a Warren Sapp, but better. I think Nroman Braman, to be honest, would have been better than Warren Sapp. And yeah, I know that's saying a lot because Warren Sapp was a good player, but I think Nroman Braman was Warren Sapp before Warren Sapp was Warren Sapp, if that makes sense. Unfortunately, through all of this, though, Nroman Braman's the wild card because, like I said, he viewed them as an investment. He was more about money than winning. Maybe if he had seen the opportunity that was at hand and the fact that they could have possibly won the Super Bowl, which with the Super Bowl, think about all the money and then merchandise and all that stuff you could do, maybe it would have turned out different. You never know. Maybe Lurie still makes him the good offer, and since he was worried about it, could you imagine Lurie and Buddy Ryan together? That would have been fun. But that would have been way down the road. But alas, none of it happened. Buddy was fired after 1990. Still kind of pissed off. I need to stop doing episodes on this Buddy Ryan team and those teams when I was growing up because I get too fired up on Thursday nights. Now I got to go have a beer or two to calm down, and next thing you know, it's Friday morning and I'm hungover. But just kidding about the hungover part. But anyway, either way, Buddy Ryan probably shouldn't have got fired. At least we figured out live. Well, you're listening to it on recorded, but I'm doing it live now. I figured out why Buddy Ryan was so beloved in Philly. Ultimately, like I said, at the time, it was not a great decision. Yeah, he didn't win anything, but I still feel like that trajectory of that team was going up. I would have loved to have seen Buddy Ryan coach that team one more year with Rich Kotite. And say what you want about Rich Kotite, he was good for a couple years before he realized who he was and became Rich Kotite. Because think about it. Randall, first year with a good offensive coordinator that knew what he was talking about, second in the MVP voting. The defense, we already knew, was on the verge of greatness. They would have been great in 91 with or without Randall. And yet those teams ended up being, to me, the biggest source of disappointment in team history, way more than the Andy Reid era. And I think those are the two comparisons usually we make. And the reason for that is Andy Reid at least won playoff games and went to NFC championships and took us to the Super Bowl. I would argue that some of those teams with Buddy Ryan had more talent than what the Andy Reid teams did. And I know that's saying a lot. And I had this conversation the other week watching the Eagles game about who would you take if you're doing an all-time Eagles team, Randall or McNabb. And I feel like I said it on this thing, and I've done nothing but the opposite since the day one here. And I've said I'm the biggest McNabb supporter. I drive the bus, blah, 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 blah. But if you're going to put one of those two quarterbacks, Randall and McNabb, with the greatest players of Eagles history, look what Randall did with Randy Moss and Chris Carter after he got his shit together. Imagine putting T.O. with Randall Cunningham. I mean, he might throw for 6,000 yards. So I do think that these Buddy Ryan teams are the bigger source of disappointment, only because it was disappointing with the Andy Reid McNabb era, but in a different way. But tell me what you think. And this is what we do in Philly. But tell me what you think. Send me a message. Which team was a bigger disappointment, the Buddy Ryan Eagles or the Andy Reid Eagles? And then while you're at it, tell me who's better, Randall or McNabb. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Jimbo_Mott, Instagram at Philly Jimbo. Be sure to check out daily This Day in Philly Sports History for a small little snippet of what we do here every week. But thank you. Go have yourselves a week. Hopefully we're celebrating the number 1 seed when I see you next week. But until then, I'll see you when I see you.